Author: Mark, the guy with the silver friend. Location: Oak, Hallow, USA. Current status: under HOA investigation. The sticker was neon orange. Not a subtle, "Hey, maybe check your mailbox" orange, but a radioactive, "We will burn your house down if you don't comply" orange. It was slapped directly onto the forehead of Gary, my 300-pound concrete gargoyle. It covered his third eye. Yes, Gary had a third eye. He also had wings that looked like bat ears, and a grimace that suggested he had just eaten bad shellfish. And, crucially, he was wearing a pair of knockoff Ray-Bans I'd glued to his face last 4th of July. I stood on my porch, coffee mug in hand, staring at the violation. It was 7:03 a.m. The dew was still fresh on the St. Augustine grass that I was required, by law, to keep between 2 and 3 inches tall. Not 2. Not 3. Somewhere in the divine middle. I walked down the driveway, my bathrobe flapping in the morning breeze. I peeled the corner of the sticker. It didn't come off. Of course it didn't. It was probably made with industrial adhesive developed by NASA for keeping heat shields on re-entering shuttles. Violation Code 14.3.c, I read aloud. Prohibited non-natural lawn ornamentation. Immediate removal required. Failure to comply will result in fines, liens, and/or public shaming. Okay, I added the public shaming part, but it was implied. I patted Gary on his cold, stony head. They found us, buddy. You have to understand, I didn't buy Gary because I have a passion for Gothic architecture. I bought Gary because my ex-wife, Linda, hated anything that wasn't beige. When she left, taking the good towels and the espresso machine, I went to a garden center with a bottle of whiskey in my system and a credit card that was technically maxed out. I saw Gary. He was ugly. He was heavy. He was totally, aggressively unnecessary. I loved him instantly. "Good morning, Mark." The voice cut through the morning air like a dentist's drill. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Mrs. Higgins, president of the Oak Hallow Homeowners Association, keeper of the bylaws, destroyer of joy. I turned slowly. She was standing on the sidewalk, flanked by her 2 poodles, Barnaby and Jones, who looked as miserable as I felt. She was holding a clipboard. Mrs. Higgins was never not holding a clipboard. I was convinced she slept with it. "Morning, Barbara," I said, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "Nice sticker work. Really highlights his cheekbones." Mrs. Higgins didn't smile. She tapped the clipboard with a pen. Click, click, click. "We gave you a warning 3 weeks ago, Mark," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "The bylaws are quite clear. Lawn ornamentation must be consistent with the natural aesthetic of the neighborhood and must not exceed 20 pounds or 18 inches in height. That thing is neither natural nor small." "Gary is natural," I argued, leaning against the statue. "He's stone. Stone comes from the earth, Barbara. He's as natural as those boulders you have in your front yard, the ones you paid $5 grand for." "My boulders are river accents," she snapped. "That is a monster wearing sunglasses." "They're UV protective," I said. "He has sensitive eyes." She stepped closer, crossing the invisible property line that separated her jurisdiction from my sanctuary. "You have 24 hours, Mark. Remove the monstrosity, or we fine you $50 a day, retroactive to the first warning." "That's 3 weeks ago." "Math is fun, isn't it?" She smiled, a shark baring teeth. "Have a blessed day." She turned and marched away, Barnaby and Jones struggling to keep up with her power-walking pace. I looked back at Gary. $50 a day. That was, well, a lot of money. Money I didn't really have, considering I was still paying off the lawyer from the divorce and the contractor who fixed the roof leak Linda had insisted didn't exist until the ceiling collapsed on the cat. "I'm sorry, Gary," I whispered. "We fought the law, and the law has a clipboard." By noon, I had called Sal. Sal was a contractor I found on Yelp under the review. He shows up, eventually. He drove a truck that sounded like it was dying of emphysema and wore t-shirts that were always 2 sizes too small. He pulled up onto the curb, another HOA violation, but I didn't care, and hopped out. He looked at Gary. He looked at me. He looked back at Gary. "You want me to move him?" Sal asked, scratching his stomach. "I want you to get rid of him, Sal. Take him away, to a farm upstate where he can run free." Sal chuckled, a wet, gravelly sound. "He's concrete, boss. He ain't running nowhere. That's gonna cost you. Heavy lift fee, disposal fee, ugly fee. Just get it done." I watched from the living room window as Sal and his cousin, a guy named Tiny, who was roughly the size of a vending machine, wrapped straps around Gary. It was like watching a loved one being taken off life support, if the loved one was a demon statue, and the doctors were sweating profusely and swearing in Italian. They hoisted Gary onto the truck bed. As they drove away, Gary bounced slightly, his sunglasses slipping down his nose, staring back at me accusingly. I felt hollow. My lawn looked empty, just a patch of flattened, yellowing grass where my symbol of freedom used to be. I looked across the street. Mrs. Higgins was at her window, pulling back the lace curtain just an inch. She was watching. And I knew, in that moment, she was smiling. The rage started in my stomach. It wasn't a hot, fiery rage. It was a cold, calculating, petty rage. The kind of rage that builds empires, or, in my case, destroys property values. She wanted natural? She wanted compliant? She wanted strictly adherent to the rules? Fine. I would give her rules. I would give her so many rules, she'd choke on them. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the aggressive typing coming from my laptop. I had a bottle of bourbon on the desk, mid-shelf stuff, good enough to burn, cheap enough to waste, and the Oak Hallow HOA covenants, conditions and restrictions, PDF open on my screen. It was 412 pages long. It was written in legalese so dense it possessed its own gravitational pull. I was on page 304, Article 14, Landscaping and Exterior Decor. I poured another finger of bourbon. My eyes were blurring, but I forced myself to focus. I was hunting for a gap in the armor. Section 14.3c, I mumbled, tracing the lines on the screen. Prohibited non-natural lawn ornamentation. I read the definition. I read it again. Then I laughed. A dry, maniacal laugh that startled my cat, Mr. Whiskers, off the printer. Definition of ornamentation. Any inanimate object constructed of wood, metal, stone, plastic or ceramic, intended for decorative purposes, placed upon the visible lawn area. Inanimate. The word floated off the screen and kissed me on the forehead. Inanimate, I whispered. Not alive. Gary was stone. Gary was inanimate. Gary was banned. But a person is animate. A person is flesh and blood and spite. The bylaws said nothing, absolutely nothing, about people standing on the lawn. You couldn't ban people from standing on property. That was kidnapping, or false imprisonment, or something unconstitutional. I wasn't a lawyer, but I had watched a lot of Law and Order. I leaned back in my chair, the gears in my head grinding the rust off. If I put a person on my lawn, a person who looked like a statue, technically I wasn't violating the ordinance. I was hosting a guest, a very still, very silver guest. I opened a new tab, Craigslist, the gig economy, the wild west of desperation and weirdness. I started typing. Title: Wanted. Living statue for long-term revenge project, body. Are you an underemployed actor? A mime with a chip on your shoulder? A person who is really good at doing absolutely nothing for extended periods? I need you. Job description: stand on my front lawn in a suburban neighborhood for 8 hours a day. You must look like a statue. You must not move when the neighbors talk to you. You must be willing to be the center of a petty war against a tyrannical HOA president. Requirements: 1. Ability to hold a pose, obviously. Thick skin, metaphorically. Willingness to wear body paint. 4. Hatred of authority figures is a plus. Pay: $25 hour plus lunch plus unlimited hydration. I hit post. The responses started trickling in the next morning. They were varied. First was Greg. Greg sent a photo of himself wearing a cardboard box. His email just said, "I am the box. The box is me." I passed. I needed a statue, not a recycling bin. Then there was Sheila. Sheila was a mime. She sent a video portfolio of her trapped in a glass case routine. It was 20 minutes long. I fell asleep at minute 4. When I woke up, she was still miming touching the glass. Too much drama. I needed stoicism. Then came Dave. Dave asked if he could sleep while standing up. He claimed he had a medical condition where he locked his knees like a horse. I didn't want a sleeping horseman on my lawn. That felt like a liability. I was about to give up. I was about to delete the ad and accept my defeat. Maybe I'd just buy a really ugly bird bath. Then an email popped up. Subject line: regarding your artistic endeavor. The body of the email was formatted in Times New Roman, size 12. Dear Sir, I have stumbled upon your request on the digital job board. While I usually reserve my talents for the stage and experimental theater in the downtown district, I find the narrative of your struggle compelling. The suburban lawn is the modern amphitheater. The HOA is the Greek chorus of oppression. I am intrigued. I possess the stillness of a mountain and the disdain of a god. I have a BFA from a university you cannot afford to attend. I am available immediately. Regards, Julian St. James. I reread the email. The Greek chorus of oppression. It was pretentious. It was over the top. It was absolutely perfect. I replied immediately, Starbucks on 4th and Main, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Don't be late. I arrived at Starbucks at 9:55 a.m. I bought a black coffee and sat by the window watching the door. At 10 o'clock a.m. on the dot, the door opened. You know how some people walk into a room? Julian didn't walk. He entered. He swept in. He was wearing a scarf. In July. It was a linen scarf, sure, but still, a scarf. He had cheekbones you could cut glass on and hair that looked like it had been styled by a wind tunnel specifically designed for models. He scanned the room, spotted me, probably because I was the only one looking at him like he was an alien, and glided over. "Mark?" he asked. His voice was a deep baritone, the kind of voice that should be narrating a documentary about sad whales. "Julian," I said, standing up to shake his hand. His grip was firm, but his hand was surprisingly soft. "Thanks for coming." He sat down, crossing his legs elegantly. "The pleasure is mine. I read your posting again on the way here. It speaks to me. The duality of man versus the collective. The individual standing firm against the crushing weight of the beige bureaucracy." "Yeah," I said, blinking. "Basically, my neighbor is a jerk, and she made me throw away my gargoyle. I want to annoy her." Julian waved a hand dismissively. "Subtext, Mark. That is the text. But the subtext is revolution." "Right. Revolution. Listen, Julian, have you done living statue work before?" He scoffed. A genuine high-drama scoff. "Have I done it? Mark, I spent 6 months in Central Park as the thinker. I didn't move for a bladder infection. I once had a pigeon land on my head and build a nest. I allowed it, because that is the commitment to the craft." "Okay," I said. "That's gross but impressive. Here's the deal. You stand on a box. You paint yourself silver. You look at Mrs. Higgins' house across the street. You do not engage. If she screams, you do nothing. If she calls the cops, you do nothing. You are a rock." Julian nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "I am not a rock, Mark. I am a mirror. I reflect her ugliness back at her. I am the silent judgment of the universe." "Sure. As long as the silent judgment costs $25 an hour." "30, Julian corrected. "And a per diem for makeup removal wipes. High-quality ones. My pores are sensitive." Done. We finished our coffees and went straight to the supply store. I tried to steer us toward Party City for a cheap Halloween toga and some spray paint. Julian looked at me like I had suggested we eat out of a dumpster. "We are creating art, Mark, not a birthday clown." We went to a fabric store. Julian spent 40 minutes touching different bolts of white fabric. "Too stiff," he mumbled. "Too sheer. This Egyptian cotton blend. It drapes, it flows, it suggests divinity." We bought 6 yards of it. Then we went to a theatrical supply store for the body paint. "Kryolan Aquacolor," Julian insisted, grabbing a tub of silver metallic paint. "It breathes. If you spray paint me, I will suffocate and die on your lawn." While dramatic, it would likely void our contract. "Good point," I said. We spent the rest of the afternoon in my garage, prepping. I built the plinth. That's what Julian called it. A plinth. It was just a sturdy wooden box I reinforced with 2x4s and painted faux marble. But calling it a plinth made Julian happy. We did a test run. Julian stripped down to his boxers in my garage, which was awkward, and began applying the silver paint. It took an hour. When he was done, he wrapped the Egyptian cotton around himself in a complex series of knots and folds. He stepped onto the box. And then he vanished. Not literally, but the person, Julian the actor, the guy who drank soy lattes, disappeared. His breathing slowed until it was imperceptible. His eyes fixed on a point in the distance. His posture was rigid, yet fluid. One arm raised slightly, pointing an accusing finger, the other clutching his toga. He looked like a Roman senator who had just caught you stealing grapes. "Holy crap," I whispered. "You look real." He didn't answer. He didn't blink. Julian? Nothing. Okay, cool. Test run over. You can move. He snapped out of it, inhaling deeply. The pose, he said, stretching his neck. It is the accuser. Do you like it? It's terrifying, I said honestly. Mrs. Higgins is going to hate it. Julian smiled, his teeth startlingly white against the silver face paint. Then let the performance begin. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt like a general on the eve of battle. I set the alarm for 6 o'clock a.m. The war for the lawn was about to begin. And I had a nuclear weapon painted silver. Author. Smark. The guy with the silver friend. Location. Oak Hallow, USA. Current status. Technically compliant, spiritually petty. The sun rose over Oak Hallow at 6:30 a.m., bathing the manicured lawns in a soft, golden light. It was a beautiful morning, the kind of morning realtors put on brochures. Birds were chirping, sprinklers were hissing rhythmically, and on my lawn, a silver man was standing on a box. Julian had arrived at 6:45 a.m. sharp. He came in a robe carrying a cooler and a yoga mat. He did 20 minutes of stretches on the driveway, loud, dramatic exhales included, before disrobing to reveal the full Greco-Roman god of disdain look. He mounted the plinth. He adjusted his toga. He found his light. And then he froze. I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee, feeling a mix of anxiety and pure, unadulterated glee. The first casualty was Mr. Henderson, who lived 2 doors down. He was walking his golden retriever, Buster. Mr. Henderson was a man of routine. Walk, poop, the dog, usually, scoop, wave, leave. He walked past my driveway. He looked at the plinth. He stopped. Buster stopped. Mr. Henderson squinted. He took off his glasses, wiped them on his shirt, and put them back on. He looked at me. "Morning, Mark," he called out, uncertainly. "Morning, Bill," I replied, raising my mug. "New statue?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the silver human on my lawn. "Just a friend visiting," I said. "He's very meditative." At that moment, a fly landed on Julian's nose. Julian did not move. He did not twitch. He simply existed, radiating an aura of judgment that hit Mr. Henderson like a physical wave. Mr. Henderson tugged Buster's leash and walked away a little faster than usual. The morning commute began. It was like watching a slow-motion car pile up. Minivans slowed to a crawl. Teenagers on bikes nearly rode into mailboxes. The school bus driver actually stopped for a full 10 seconds, opening the door to yell, "Is that a dude?" I waved. "It's Art!" Then the storm arrived. I heard the click, clack, click of the heels before I saw her. Mrs. Higgins. She wasn't walking. She was marching. She was a heat-seeking missile in a floral blouse. She stopped at the edge of the lawn. She looked at Julian. Julian looked. Well, he looked through her, his silver eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, perhaps contemplating the fall of Rome or the price of arugula. "Mark!" she shrieked. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation. I stood up and walked down the porch steps. "Good morning, Barbara. Lovely day for a walk." She pointed a trembling finger at Julian. "What is that?" "That?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "That's Julian." "It's a statue," she yelled. "We discussed this. Bylaw 14.3c, no non-natural ornamentation. You removed the gargoyle only to replace it with this silver monstrosity." "He's not a statue, Barbara," I said calmly. "He's a person. You can't ban people." "He is standing on a pedestal." "It's a plinth," I corrected. "And he's practicing stillness. It's a very advanced form of yoga. Tantric standing. Very spiritual." Mrs. Higgins marched up to the plinth. She was now within striking distance of Julian. She peered closely at him. The paint job was flawless. We had contoured his abs. He looked like he was cast in sterling silver. "He's not breathing," she whispered, horror dawning on her face. "You've taxidermied a man." "Don't be ridiculous," I said. "Julian, say hello to the nice lady." Julian remained frozen. His commitment was terrifying. Mrs. Higgins narrowed her eyes. "He's a statue, and I am writing you a fine immediately, $50, and another $50 for the unauthorized structure he's standing on." She reached out a finger, a long, manicured finger. She was going to poke him. "I wouldn't do that," I warned. "He's in the zone." She ignored me. She jabbed her finger into Julian's silver-painted oblique. Now I had expected Julian to maybe flinch. Or break character and say, "Hey, watch it!" I did not expect Julian to unleash a sneeze of such magnitude that it registered on the Richter scale. Achoo! It was explosive. It was wet. And because he had held it in for the sake of art, it came out with the force of a cannon. Mrs. Higgins shrieked and jumped back, tripping over her own feet and landing on the soft, compliant St. Augustine grass. Julian immediately snapped back into his pose, freezing mid-sniffle. "He moved!" Mrs. Higgins screamed, scrambling to her feet. "He sneezed! It's alive!" "Bless you, Julian," I said. He... She was hyperventilating. "He's a person!" "That's what I said, Barbara. You can't fine me for having a guest on my lawn. Show me the bylaw that says no silver guests." She scrambled for her clipboard, flipping pages frantically. "Loitering, public nuisance, indecent exposure." "He's wearing a toga," I pointed out. "He's more dressed than your husband when he gets the paper in his boxers." Her face turned a shade of purple I had only seen on bruised plums. "This isn't over, Mark. This is a mockery of this community. I will have this street performer removed." She stormed off. I turned to Julian. "You okay, buddy?" Julian slowly turned his head. He didn't break the pose, but he whispered out of the corner of his mouth. "The pollen count is high today, Mark. My allergies are the enemy of my craft." "You're doing great," I said. "Hydrate. Round 2 starts in 10 minutes. By 11 o'clock a.m., the sun had moved. The golden hour was over, and we had entered the solar flare phase of the day. Julian was sweating. I could see it. Tiny beads of moisture were breaking through the silver paint on his forehead. He wasn't breaking character, but he was starting to sway slightly, like a metronome losing its rhythm. "Mark," he hissed without moving his lips. "I am melting. The silver is becoming a conductor. I am a baked potato." "Hang in there," I said. "I'm on it." I called Sal. "Sal, it's Mark. I need you back." "The gargoyle come back to life?" Sal asked. I could hear him chewing something crunchy. "No, I need a structure, a shade structure, for the new statue." Sal arrived 20 minutes later when he saw Julian. He stopped his truck in the middle of the street. He got out, walked up to the plinth, and stared. "It's a guy," Sal said. "It's Julian," I said. "Why is he silver?" "Art," Julian whispered. Sal nodded slowly. Right. Art. Okay. What do you need, boss? He needs shade, but Mrs. Higgins will find me for a permanent structure, so I need something temporary. Sal scratched his chin. He looked at the blazing sun. He looked at Julian, who was now squinting against the glare. A gazebo, Sal said, but on wheels. Excuse me? You put wheels on it, it ain't a structure, Sal explained, tapping his temple. It's a vehicle or mobile equipment. Same loophole the hot dog guys use. I got some lumber left over from a deck job. I can rig up a Roman-style roof, make it look classy. Do it, I said. Make it look like Caesar would park his chariot under it. Sal and Tiny went to work. They built the Spite pergola in record time. It was a 4-post wooden frame with a lattice roof, draped in white canvas. And, true to his word, Sal mounted the entire thing on 4 heavy-duty caster wheels. They rolled it over Julian. Oh, blessed shade, Julian sighed, finally relaxing his shoulders. That'll be $500, Sal said, plus $50 for the weirdness factor. Worth it, I said. We were high-fiving when a white sedan with the City of Oak Hallow logo pulled up. Oh no, I muttered. A man in a short-sleeved button-down shirt stepped out. He had a badge on his belt and a measuring tape on his hip. Code enforcement. Mrs. Higgins had called in the big guns. Mr. Miller? The inspector asked, consulting his tablet. We received a complaint about an unpermitted accessory structure. It's not a structure, I said quickly. It's a parasol. The inspector looked at the pergola. He looked at the 4x4 posts. He kicked one of the wheels. It has a roof, sir, and posts. That requires a permit. And a setback variance. You're 10 feet too close to the curb. Sal stepped forward, wiping sawdust off his hands. Whoa, whoa, Chief. Look at the feet. The inspector looked down. It has wheels. Exactly, Sal said, grinning. It ain't attached to the ground. It ain't a permanent fixture. According to City Code 45A, Section 2, temporary mobile shade devices don't need a permit if they remain mobile. The inspector frowned. He poked the pergola. It rolled a few inches. See? Sal said. Mobile. We can move it to the backyard right now, or down the street. It's basically a wagon. The inspector looked at me. He looked at Sal. Then he looked at Julian, who was standing under the pergola, striking a new pose. Julian had one hand on his forehead, looking pained, and the other hand extended as if reaching for lost love. And the silver gentleman? The inspector asked. Part of the aesthetic, I said. He comes with the wagon. The inspector sighed, a long, weary sigh of a man who was underpaid to deal with suburban insanity. It has wheels, the Sarsia, Inspector muttered to himself. God help me, it has wheels. He tapped on his tablet. Fine. As long as it's not anchored, it's technically compliant. But if I see one stake in the ground, I'm writing you up. Understood, I said. As the inspector drove away, Julian shifted his pose. He dropped to one knee, head bowed, hand over his heart. What's that one called? Sal asked. The inspector's regret, Julian said solemnly. Nice, Sal said. I like this guy. We survived the morning. We survived the sun. We survived the code enforcement. But Mrs. Higgins was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was a woman who escalated. At 2:00 p.m., a police cruiser rolled down the street. No sirens, but the lights were flashing silently. Here we go, I said to Julian, who was eating a granola bar while holding a pose that looked like Atlas shrugging while snacking. Hide the food. Julian swallowed the granola bar whole, like a pelican, and froze. Officer Miller stepped out of the car. I knew Miller. He was a 20-year veteran of the force. He had seen meth labs, bar fights, and high-speed chases. But nothing drained the life out of his eyes quite like a domestic dispute in Oak Hollow. He walked up the driveway, hitching up his belt. Mrs. Higgins was already there, practically vibrating with righteousness. "There he is, officer!" she shouted, pointing at Julian. "The vagrant! The menace!" Miller looked at Julian. Julian looked at the horizon. "Afternoon, Mark," Miller said tiredly. "Officer Miller." I nodded. "Mrs. Higgins says you have a deranged individual loitering on your property and making obscene gestures at the neighbors," Miller said, reading from his notepad. "He's not deranged," I said. "He's an artist." "He flipped me off," Mrs. Higgins lied. "I saw it. He did a rude finger thing." "Julian?" I asked. "Did you do a rude finger thing?" Julian remained frozen. "Sir," Officer Miller said, addressing Julian, "I'm going to need you to identify yourself." Julian didn't move. "Sir," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, "don't make me tase a statue." Julian's eyes shifted to the officer. Slowly, gracefully, he broke the pose. He lowered his arms. He turned to Miller and spoke in his deepest, most theatrical voice. "Am I being detained, officer?" Miller blinked. "What?" "Am I under arrest?" Julian enunciated. "For if I am not, I am exercising my First Amendment right to expression. My body is the canvas. My silence is the poem." Miller looked at me. "Is he serious?" "Deadly," I said. "I have my lawyer on the phone if you need him. My brother-in-law, Dave, he specializes in, well, mostly traffic tickets, but he's very excited about this." I held up my phone. "Say hi to Dave, officer." Miller rubbed his temples. "Mrs. Higgins, is this man on your property?" "No," she huffed. "He's on Mark's property, but he's looking at my property aggressively." "Aggressive looking isn't a crime, ma'am," Miller said, "unless he's threatening you." "His aura is threatening," she insisted. "Look at him. He's shiny." Miller looked at Julian. Julian looked back, channeling the energy of a disappointed parent. "You got a permit for the paint?" Miller asked, trying to find something, anything to write down. "It is non-toxic, water-soluble, and FDA approved," Julian recited. "Would you like to see the material safety data sheet? I keep it in my toga." Miller let out a laugh. He couldn't help it. It started as a snort and turned into a chuckle. "You keep an MSDS in your toga?" "Safety first, officer," Julian said, giving a small, silver salute. Miller shook his head. "All right, look, Mrs. Higgins, no law is being broken here. He's on private property. He's not naked. He's not screaming. He's just being silver." "But I have real crimes to solve, Barbara," Miller said, cutting her off. "Someone stole a catalytic converter at the mall. I'm going to go deal with that. Mark, keep your statue on your lawn. Silver guy, stay hydrated." "My name is Julian St. James," Julian said, extending a silver hand. "I actually saw your performance in the Police Benevolent Association talent show last year. Your rendition of Danny Boy was spirited." Miller's jaw dropped. "You saw that?" "I have an eye for talent," Julian said smoothly. "We should take a picture. For the gram." And that is how Mrs. Higgins watched, from 5 feet away, as the police officer she had summoned proceeded to take a selfie with the silver man she hated. "Say justice!" Julian cried. "Justice!" Miller grinned. Mrs. Higgins made a sound like a tea kettle boiling over, turned on her heel, and marched back to her house. She slammed the front door so hard the wreath fell off. "You're good," I told Julian, as Miller drove away. Julian resumed his pose on the plinth. "I know," he whispered. "I, author Mark, the guy with the viral lawn. Location: Oak Hollow, USA. Current status: internet famous, local pariah." It started, as most modern disasters do, on TikTok. A teenager named Kyle, who lived 3 streets over and usually communicated exclusively in grunts and skateboard noises, had filmed Julian scaring a UPS driver. The driver had walked up to the porch, glanced at the silver man under the pergola, and asked, "Is this address 404? Julian had slowly rotated his head, fixed the driver with a stare that could curdle milk, and whispered, "The address is irrelevant. We are all lost." The driver dropped the package and ran. Kyle uploaded the video with the caption, "HOA final boss, Mashard living statue. Turkaren repellent." By Wednesday morning, it had 3 million views. By Wednesday afternoon, the tourists arrived. They came in Priuses. They came in lifted trucks. They came in minivans packed with children who had sticky hands and loud questions. They parked on the street, blocking driveways, much to Mrs. Higgins's apoplectic rage, and stood on the sidewalk, holding up their phones like religious icons. "Do the sneeze," a kid shouted. Julian did not do the sneeze. Julian was a professional. He stood in the silent sentinel pose, gazing stoically over the heads of the paparazzi. The neighborhood, previously a united front of manicured boredom, fractured into 2 distinct tribes. Faction A, the Free Gary movement. These were the cool neighbors, the ones who secretly hated the rule about beige mailboxes. They started leaving offerings at the base of the plinth. Bottles of artisanal water. Flowers. One guy left a 6-pack of IPA with a note that said, "Stay strong, Silverman." Faction B, the property value purists. Led by Mrs. Higgins, this group believed that Julian was a harbinger of the apocalypse. They stood on their porches, arms crossed, glaring. They called the police non-emergency line so often that the dispatcher started answering with, "Is he still silver?" "Yes? Have a nice day, Barbara." The tip jar I put out, Julian's Juilliard Fund, was overflowing. By Friday, Julian had made $400 in cash. "Mark," Julian said during his 10-minute hydration break, wiping silver sweat from his brow. "I am a sensation. The audience is captivated, but I am fatigued. The demand for stillness is exceeding the supply of my hamstrings." "You need a shift change," I agreed. "We need to expand the cast." I went back to Craigslist. 2 hours later, I hired Chloe. Chloe was a theater major at the local community college. She specialized in physical comedy and had a terrifying ability to not blink. "What's the role?" she asked, chewing gum aggressively. "Weeping Angel," I said. "From Doctor Who. Can you do it?" She spat the gum into a bush. "I was born to do it." That weekend, the tourists got a double feature. Julian took the morning shift as the Silver God. At 1:00 p.m., they did a shift change that looked like a changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace, but with more body glitter. Then, Chloe took over. She wore a gray, stone-colored dress and gray face paint. She stood with her hands over her face. The first time Mrs. Higgins walked by to check for bylaw violations, Chloe waited until Higgins looked down at her clipboard. Then, soundlessly, she moved 3 feet closer and froze in a snarling pose. Mrs. Higgins looked up. "Ah!" She dropped her pen. Chloe didn't move. She was stone. "Mark!" Mrs. Higgins shrieked. "The statue is haunting me." "It's just shadows, Barbara," I called from the porch. "Maybe you need to get your prescription checked." The war had turned psychological, and we were winning. The letter arrived via certified mail. The envelope was thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of lavender and litigation. Notice of emergency. HOA board meeting. Agenda item 1. The prohibition of living lawn ornaments. Agenda item 2. The definition of loitering with intent to annoy. Agenda item 3. The excessive use of silver paint. "This is it," I told Julian. We were in my living room. Julian was out of costume, wearing a turtleneck and sipping herbal tea. The final showdown. Julian nodded, gravely. "They want to censor the art. They want to silence the muse." "They want to fine me $5,000, I said. "Same thing," Julian said. "We must prepare. I will coach you on your monologue. You need to project from the diaphragm. When you say Constitution, I want to feel it in my teeth." The meeting was held on Tuesday night at the community center. It was a packed house. The Free Gary faction took up the left side of the room, wearing t-shirts I had hastily screen-printed. The property value faction took the right, clutching pearls and bylaws. Mrs. Higgins sat at the head table, flanked by the treasurer, a man who looked like a turtle without a shell, and the secretary, who was aggressively taking minutes. "Order!" Mrs. Higgins banged a gavel. It was a surprisingly large gavel for such a small woman. "We are here to address the crisis on Elm Street." "It's not a crisis, it's culture," someone from the back yelled. "It is a circus," Mrs. Higgins retorted. "Mr. Mark Miller has circumvented our rules, mocked our standards, and turned our quiet neighborhood into a roadside attraction. We are voting tonight to amend the bylaws to explicitly ban human statuary and performative loitering." She looked at me with a smirk. "Mr. Miller, do you have anything to say before we vote?" I stood up. Julian had told me to take a dramatic pause. I counted to 3. "Neighbors," I began. "Friends, Romans." Julian had insisted on the Romans part. "We live in a society of rules. I get that. We want our grass green and our trash cans hidden. But at what cost? When they took Gary the Gargoyle, I said nothing. When they measured my grass with a ruler, I said nothing. But now? Now they want to tell us who can stand on our own property." I pulled out a pocket constitution. Amazon 4.99s. "The First Amendment protects freedom of speech. And what is speech? Is it just words? Or is it the silent, silver protest of a man in a toga?" "It's an eyesore," the turtle treasurer grumbled. "It is art," I countered. "And if we ban art, what's next? Banning children? Banning laughter? Banning Mrs. Higgins's Tuesday night polka music, which, frankly, is louder than my statue?" A ripple of laughter went through the room. Mrs. Higgins turned red. "That is irrelevant," she snapped. "The issue is compliance. We have rules about non-natural ornamentation. A silver man is not natural." "Is he not?" I asked. "Is he not flesh and bone? Does he not bleed if you poke him?" Which, for the record, Mrs. Higgins has tried to do. "He is a mockery!" she screamed, losing her cool. "He is a spite statue, and he violates the spirit of this community, which is uniformity." "Uniformity," I repeated. Interesting word, because uniformity implies that everyone follows the rules. No exceptions. I signaled to Kyle, the TikTok teen, who was manning the projector. If we are banning non-natural ornamentation, I said, then surely we must ban all of it. The screen flickered to life. It was drone footage. High definition, 4K video taken from above. It panned over the neighborhood, beautiful and green. Then it lowered. It hovered over Mrs. Higgins' backyard, specifically a secluded corner behind her prize-winning hydrangeas. The camera zoomed in. There, hidden amongst the foliage, was a gnome. But not just any gnome. This was a bad boy gnome. He was wearing a leather jacket. He had a cigarette in his mouth, and his pants were pulled down to reveal a ceramic butt. The room gasped. "Is that a mooning gnome?" someone whispered. "It's vintage," Mrs. Higgins shrieked, standing up. "It was a gift from my late aunt. It has sentimental value." "It's non-natural ornamentation," I said, pointing at the screen. "Code 14.3. Immediate removal required. Or are the rules only for people you don't like?" Chaos erupted. The Free Gary faction started chanting, "Moon Gnome! Moon Gnome!" The Property Value faction looked betrayed. "I yield the rest of my time," I shouted over the noise, "to the gentleman in silver!" At the back of the room, Julian stood up. He had been sitting there the whole time, wearing a trench coat. He threw the coat off. He was in full regalia, silver paint, toga, laurel wreath. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the center aisle, looked at Mrs. Higgins, and executed a slow, profound, and deeply condescending bow. Then he froze. The meeting didn't end. It dissolved. We won the battle, but the war wasn't over. The vote to ban living statues was deadlocked. The mooning gnome scandal had cost Mrs. Higgins her political capital. Half the board resigned in protest. But Mrs. Higgins was still the president, and a wounded animal is dangerous. On Thursday, the siege began. Julian was on the plinth, striking the pondering philosopher pose. I was inside making a sandwich. Suddenly, I heard a sound like heavy rain, but there were no clouds. I looked out the window. Mrs. Higgins had adjusted her sprinkler heads. Her oscillating sprinklers were no longer oscillating. They were fixed. Targeted. A steady, high-pressure stream of water was arcing over the street, bypassing the sidewalk and hitting Julian directly in the chest. It was a tactical strike. "My paint!" Julian yelled, breaking character as the water hit him. "It's water-soluble! I'm melting!" I ran outside. "Turn it off, Barbara." She was standing on her porch, holding a hose for good measure, adding a second stream of water. "Just watering my petunias, Mark. Wind must be carrying it." "There is no wind." I grabbed the patio umbrella, the big one from the backyard, and charged. I opened it over Julian like a shield wall. Thwack, thwack, splash. The water hammered against the canvas. "Hold the line!" I yelled to Julian. "My base layer is compromised," Julian cried. "I look like a patchy Dalmatian." "We need countermeasures," I said. I ran to the garage. I grabbed my own hose. I didn't spray her. That would be assault. I sprayed up. I created a water curtain, a wall of mist that intercepted her stream. For an hour, we stood there. The battle of the hoses. The street was flooding. Cars were driving through 3 inches of water. Finally, Mrs. Higgins turned her water off. Not because she gave up, but because Mr. Henderson walked by and told her she was washing away his mulch. But the water was just the beginning. The next day, she started the music. Opera, Wagner, Ride of the Valkyries. On a loop. Blasting from speakers pointed directly at my house. Julian, to his credit, adapted. He changed his pose to the conductor, waving his arms in time with the music. It backfired on her. The tourists loved it. Then came the psychological warfare. Every time Mrs. Higgins came outside to get her mail, Julian would mirror her. She walked to the mailbox? Julian walked in place on his plinth. She scratched her nose. Julian scratched his nose. She glared. Julian glared. It was subtle. It was maddening. It was art. On Saturday morning, the breaking point arrived. I was sitting on the porch, watching Julian, who was currently mirroring Mrs. Higgins, pruning her roses by miming pruning invisible roses. The front door of the Higgins house opened, but it wasn't Barbara. It was Mr. Higgins. Harold. Harold was a quiet man, a man who had seemingly faded into the beige paint of his own house over the last 30 years. He walked across the street. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had heard Ride of the Valkyries one too many times. He walked up to my porch. "Mark," he said softly. "Harold?" I said. He looked at Julian. Julian slowly turned his head and offered Harold a silver nod. "She's losing it, Mark," Harold said. His voice cracked. "Last night, she woke up screaming that the Silver Man was in the refrigerator. She thinks he's everywhere. She tried to put a violation sticker on the cat because it was sitting too still." "I'm sorry, Harold," I said. "But she started this. She took Gary." "I know," Harold said. He reached into his pocket. "I know she did. She's obsessed with control. But I just want to watch the game in peace. I want to sleep without hearing about bylaws." He looked at me with pleading eyes. "What will it take?" Harold asked. "What do you want? Money? A public apology? Her resignation?" I looked at Julian. He was magnificent. He was ridiculous. He was starting to peel around the elbows. "I don't want money," I said. I looked at the empty spot on my lawn where the grass was still yellow. "I want amnesty," I said. "Total amnesty, for the statue." "The silver guy?" Harold asked. "No," I said. "The original, the OG. I want Gary back. And I want a signed letter from the board stating that Gary is a grandfathered historical landmark, exempt from all future aesthetic rulings." Harold sighed. He looked back at his house, where Mrs. Higgins was currently yelling at a squirrel. "I can make that happen," Harold said. "I'm the vice president. I never use my vote because I'm afraid of her. But I'm more afraid of her going insane." "Deal?" I held out my hand. Harold shook it. "Deal. Please, just make the Silver Man go away." "Done," I said. I walked over to the author. Mark, the guy with the silver neighbor. Location, Oak Hollow, USA. Current status, victorious. Mostly. The peace treaty was signed on a Sunday. It wasn't signed at the UN or in a palace of mirrors. It was signed on my kitchen island, which still had a faint ring of silver paint on it from where Julian had set down a coffee mug. Harold Higgins sat opposite me. He looked like a man who had just defused a bomb, using only a pair of dull scissors. He slid the paper across the granite. "It's done," Harold said, his voice hushed. "The board voted in an emergency session this morning, while Barbara was indisposed." "Indisposed?" I asked, clicking my pen. "She's rearranging her spice rack alphabetically by genus," Harold sighed. "It will buy us 3 hours." I read the document. It was beautiful. Resolution 2024 Porse B. The Oak Hollow Homeowners Association hereby grants a permanent non-revocable variance for the property located at 404 Elm Street. Item 1. 1. Non-standard lawn ornamentation, specifically the concrete entity known as Gary, is permitted to reside on the premises. Item 2. In exchange, the homeowner agrees to immediately cease all living art installations, performances, and silver-based gatherings. This is legally binding? I asked. I had the HOA lawyer notarize it, Harold said. He's terrified of the Silverman, too. He thinks it's a sign of the end times. I signed the paper. It felt heavier than my mortgage deed. Thank you, Harold, I said. You're a good man. Harold stood up, adjusting his beige windbreaker. I just want the tourists to leave, Mark. I haven't been able to back out of my driveway in 4 days without a teenager asking me to do a TikTok dance. I don't know what that is, but I know I don't want to do it. He walked to the door, then paused. Is he leaving today? Yeah, I said. The grand finale is at noon. Harold nodded. Good. He opened the door, looked left and right like a spy crossing enemy lines, and sprinted back to his house. I walked out to the porch. Julian was there. He wasn't in costume. He was wearing normal clothes, skinny jeans, a vintage leather jacket, and oversized sunglasses. He looked like an off-duty celebrity. So, Julian said, looking at the empty plinth. The stage goes dark. You won, I said. You broke them. Julian smiled. We broke them, Mark. It was a collaborative effort. I provided the aesthetic. You provided the rage. I have your check, I said, handing him an envelope. It contained his hourly wages, plus the hazard pay for the sprinkler incident. It was a significant amount of money. Enough to fix my roof, if I hadn't spent it on a spite statue. Julian took the envelope but didn't open it. Keep the tip jar money, he said. Donate it to a mime school or buy Gary a hat. What are you going to do now? I asked. Back to New York? Hollywood? Julian looked down the street. He took a slow, deep breath of the suburban air. Fresh-cut grass, dryer sheets, and suppressed resentment. I don't know, he mused. I've grown fond of this place. There is a certain energy here, a friction. Art requires friction, Mark. And this neighborhood is sandpaper. Well, I said, don't get any ideas. The treaty only covers Gary. If you come back, Mrs. Higgins will actually buy a sniper rifle. Julian laughed. A real laugh, not a theatrical one. Farewell, Mark. It has been an honor serving in the trenches with you. He got into his car, a beat-up Honda Civic that had seen better days, and drove off. As he turned the corner, he honked once, a long, mournful toot. I stood there for a minute. It was quiet. The birds were singing. The sprinklers hissed. It felt boring. Sal, I yelled into the phone 10 minutes later. Bring him home. The return of Gary was a solemn affair. Sal and Tiny unloaded him from the truck with a reverence usually reserved for war heroes. They placed him back on his patch of yellowed grass. I adjusted his sunglasses. I wiped a smudge of dirt off his third eye. Welcome back, buddy, I whispered. I went inside and grabbed a silver spray paint can. I didn't paint Gary, that would be sacrilege, but I found an old participation medal from a 5K run I walked 3 years ago. I painted it silver. I hung it around Gary's neck. Gary the Gargoyle, veteran of the Silver Wars. Life returned to normal, or as normal as Oak Hollow ever got. The tourists trickled away. The TikTok comments stopped coming. Mrs. Higgins resumed her patrols, though she refused to look at the left side of the street when she passed my house. She walked with a permanent crick in her neck, staring steadfastly at the right side gutters. Summer turned to fall. The leaves changed. The air got crisp. I was sitting on my porch one Saturday afternoon, drinking a pumpkin ale, don't judge me, and watching the neighborhood. A moving truck pulled up. It wasn't just any moving truck. It was a luxury moving service. The movers wore uniforms with epaulets. They were carrying furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum of uncomfortable chairs. They stopped 3 houses down. The Miller house. No relation. The Millers had moved out 6 months ago to find themselves in Arizona, and the house had been sitting empty, a beige blight on the market. "Who bought the Miller place?" I asked Mr. Henderson, who was walking Buster. "Don't know," Henderson said, stopping to watch. "Must be money, though. Did you see that chandelier they just carried in? It looked like a crystal jellyfish." We watched. A car pulled up behind the truck, a familiar beat-up Honda Civic. My stomach dropped. My heart soared. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was wearing a velvet smoking jacket and holding a cane. He didn't need a cane. It was purely an accessory. He looked up at the house. He looked down the street. He saw me. He took off his sunglasses. It was Julian. "No way," I whispered. Julian raised his cane in a salute. I walked over. I couldn't help myself. "Julian?" "Hello, neighbor," he beamed. You bought a house?" "Cash," he said. "Between the GoFundMe, the settlement from a slip and fall I had at a Trader Joe's last year, and the viral revenue, I decided to invest in real estate." "You're living here? In Oak Hollow?" "I told you, Mark," he said, sweeping his arm toward the beige siding of his new home. "I love the friction." "Mrs. Higgins is going to have a stroke," I said. "Her heart cannot take this." "Oh, she'll be fine," Julian said. "I'm going to be a model resident. I have read the bylaws. I have memorized the covenants." He leaned in close, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Did you know," he whispered, "that there is absolutely no rule in the book that specifies what color a house must be? It only says earth tones." "Julian," I warned, "don't." "Silver is an earth tone, Mark," he said. "Silver comes from the earth. It is a metal, mined from the crust of our planet." "You're going to paint the house silver." "Not just silver," he corrected. "Chrome. I want it to be visible from space. I want Google Earth to glitch when it flies over." He turned back to the movers. "Careful with the bust of Nefertiti. She is fragile." I walked back to my porch. I sat down next to Gary. I cracked open another beer. Across the street, Mrs. Higgins' front door opened. She stepped out to get her mail. She looked down the street. She saw the moving truck. She saw Julian. She froze. Julian saw her. He didn't wave. He didn't yell. He simply struck a pose. One hand on the cane, one hand on his hip, head tilted back in regal defiance. Mrs. Higgins dropped her mail. I took a sip of my beer. I patted Gary on the head.